as you know, in America particularly, has always prided itself on its ability to use protest to influence policymakers to get results. This is something that goes back to the labor movement of the early 20th century, goes back to the radical left socialist communists of the early 20th century in terms of the New Deal, going through to the civil rights movement, going back to the anti-war movement of Vietnam. Would your position in terms of, since you go back to Walter Lippmann, in terms of the attempts by the political elites, or what you call the power elite, or what is known by as overall as the power elites, to remove the modern population from politics, would you argue that the, the extent to which the left was responsible for those political policy advances is somewhat blown out of proportion, and there's somewhat of a realpolitik in terms of the machinations of elites behind the scenes that are more at play? Or are you saying that the age of end of mass politics is a more recent phenomenon? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that particular
No,
point.
it's a really good question. I think that the major epochal shifts for me are pre and post World War II, and that has to do with American political development and the maturation of the American state at particular levels and at particular times. I think there was much more ability for masses of people to shape policy and policy making and decision making before World War II. And there was much less ability to shape after, broadly speaking. Foreign policy and the macroeconomy in particular, I think, became issue areas that were walled off from most popular influence and from public opinion. And we could talk about that term too after World War II, because the state formation that was created as a result of the war, and as the coming together of a concatenation of ideological and material factors, relatively effectively insulated primary choices about what the United States should do in the world and how the United States should organize its political economy, um, making it more difficult for masses of people to shape things. And where that intersects with the story of the left, I think the left was consciously. Consciously and effectively eradicated as an institutional force in American life, really after World War II as well. Um, this is true of the radicals within labor unions. This is true of the the Communist Party of the USA. This is true later in the '60s of the Black radical tradition and other indigenous and third worldist movements. I think they have been systematically disempowered by the center and the center right. That's a connected story, but not totally. Uh, it doesn't totally overlap. So that's how I would put it, just as a starting point.
Would you argue that this demobilization of the radical left in the United States is something that happens when you say after World War II? Would you say that there's a lot of space between after World War II? You say that starts with the rise of Nixon, or is it
Oh
something?
no, I mean they demolished the Communist Party and radical labor in the beginning in the late '40s, earlier really, but really beginning in the late '40s into the 1950s. And I always think it was very difficult that you were going to have any genuinely radical left without a mobilized left-wing labor movement, and for a variety of reasons, in my opinion, primarily due to the free land. The American labor movement was also always more conservative, small c, than, for example, European labor. European labor always had more radical groupings. There were radical groupings in U.S. labor, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century. But I think by the time of its institutionalization in the '30s, '40s, and really into the '50s, it had been much less radical, and the leaders of labor essentially made a deal with the national security state that they weren't going to fundamentally challenge the Cold War and that they were going to be fundamentally anti-communist, which didn't necessarily have to be the case, and not necessarily predicted if you're looking at 1880, that by 80 years later, American labor movement would be profoundly anti-communist and anti-radical. But that is what happened. Nixon is already the you know the die was cast, in my opinion, and we could even go larger. I think the die was really cast in a macro historical sense in 1914, but that's a different question.
Well, how do you juxtapose your position with the rise of Black Power, the rise of the radicals of the '60s, and the Civil Rights Movement? Would you argue that it actually was not a radical political constituency at all, but rather more liberal? Or would you also argue, as far as some have gone, that much of some of the Black Power rhetoric was actually more conservative in terms of what it was actually administrating in terms of solutions?
Well, I think when you're looking at the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, there are undoubtedly radical elements, but the problem is that it's trying to fit them into a left-right political binary that wasn't really used in the United States until the 1940s and doesn't really quite make sense, mapping onto American political ideologies, which until really World War II and really after World War II were not considered to be like on the same left-right spectrum as operated in Europe. So when you look at the Black Power movement or you look at the civil rights movement, when you're trying to place it on a left-right spectrum, it never really quite fits. This is less true of Black Power, particularly in the 1960s when it's very self-consciously left wing, because that had been the politics of the previous 20 years. But it certainly contained what I would consider to be socially conservative elements. It seemed to be patriarchal in some regards, but it also seemed to be genuinely revolutionary in other regards, and anti-capitalist and Marxist and pro-colonial and pro-decolonization. So it's my understanding is it's not my specialty, but my understanding is that it was an amalgamation of features that cannot so easily be placed into the left-right binary. I think the civil rights movement likewise had different moments, different people who are advocating particular things. I think Martin Luther King Jr. is a much more left-wing thinker than he has been amalgamated into the liberal imaginary, particularly. I think he was a left-wing thinker, frankly, from the beginning. But the Poor People's Campaign toward the end of his life, plans for the various Poor People's marches, I think were quite radical, which probably didn't endear him to the official organs of state. So no, of course, there's mass political movements. I mean, is it fair to call the civil rights movement a left-wing movement? Yes and no. We'd have to talk about what we meant by that, but it was certainly a mass-based political movement that shaped things. I would say that is absolutely correct. Also, one would notice that that's not really in the area of foreign policy or the macroeconomy. That was about domestic social legislation and obviously race, which is very important. But it's not the two arenas of social life that were explicitly cordoned off from the public, at least in my opinion, which were again foreign policy, macroeconomy.
So so let's focus on that particularly. For your purposes, the end of mass politics relatively importantly deals with two issues, particularly foreign policy
Yeah,
and
yes and no. Yes and no. So I think there's a very famous 2014 paper by Gillens and Page, I believe their names are, which just effectively shows that ordinary Americans' interests don't have an independent impact. I think that's the language that they use on policy, whereas business interests and capitalist interests do. So it's not just foreign policy and the macroeconomy, but I think that something like the civil rights movement would have been you couldn't have that, or it wouldn't have been successful, at least even on that scale, to, for example, have the United States not be hegemon. I don't think that was ever going to be an option in the same way. I think for a variety of reasons over the 20th century, the liberal power elite, um, its ideology on race liberalized, became more progressive, or what we would call in today's language left, again, for a variety of reasons. And I don't think that power elite went left on the macroeconomy or went left on the foreign policy.
well, here at This Is Revolution podcast, we postulate that the Cold War realpolitik had a lot more to do with that than people ascribe in terms of.
Yeah, that's the Mary Dudziak argument. I mean, I think it's both. I think that within the mainline elite Protestantism, there's long abolitionist strands going back deep into the 19th century, not before, and so those became more powerful for a variety of reasons. I think the liberal Protestant mainline secularized, and that their sort of eschatology, which was previously millenarian and previously linked to like literally God after secularization, began to take different forms. And one of them, one of the things that was sort of a redemption narrative, redemption arc, was found in the civil rights movement. So I think Cold War geopolitics is one factor. I think secularization of the liberal Protestant elite is another factor, and I think the welcoming of the welcoming of previously populations not considered white, like Jews and Irish and Italians, into the liberal white power elite also shape things. That there was recent examples of whitening, and people within those communities felt a kinship to the African American community in the United States. So I think there's a lot going on there, but Cold War geopolitics is a factor.